Many clients and brands that come to us really struggle with their PMAX campaigns, whether it's scaling them, whether it's getting them off the ground in the first place. And in this video, I want to share a little step-by-step guide, a step-by-step checklist of what you should do when running PMAX campaigns. And I used the example of a $10,000, $10,400 per day PMAX campaign that we are running for a client right now. It's not the first campaign to hit that magic threshold of 10K, but I thought it's a good example to show the approach that we have used here. And basically, I want to give you all the steps so that if you want to launch a new PMAX campaign, or if you say, hey, I really want to scale things up now, it's something that you can refer to, especially because PMAX is such a black box. And of course, there are still some uncertainties within PMAX, but after a few $1 million in PMAX ad spend alone, I think we have learned quite a few things in terms of how to run a PMAX campaign profitably and properly. So there are some issues with PMAX, right? And those issues are basically when to start a PMAX really and how to avoid those inconsistencies that you usually have, how to optimize it on an ongoing basis, because many people wonder like what to actually do with a PMAX once it's live, right? And also how to scale it and how to structure it for scaling properly, because some people can spend 300 a day, others 100, others 500, and sometimes it's not that clear what you have to do to move things forward. So those are the things that I will cover here today. And let's start with the very, very basic, just, super simple. Before you even get started, you have to give it like 14 days or so of actual spending. So what I see is that people that want to try PMAX, they just give it like 200 a day in ad spend, and then they wait for 3 days, then they judge it, then they pause it or remove it depending on how it goes. That's the first mistake. You should really say, okay, the budget that I dedicate to PMAX, I will do that for 14 days in a row. That's just like a number that from my experience worked quite well. 30 is better, but I know that most people don't want to just dedicate 30 days of ad spend to something if it's not working. But 14 days is really sort of necessary. And the minimum budget should absolutely, at the bare minimum, be $50 a day. Ideally 100, but 50, if you go below that, I wouldn't bother about PMAX in the first place. So that is actually pretty important. But those 14 days, make sure that you are not pausing or dismissing PMAX as not working too early. So that's just the very basis. Now let's talk about how to actually structure your PMAX when you launch it. There are multiple ways to go about that, and it completely depends on your store and your product offering. So if you have, let's say, a small store with just a handful of products and they are all very tightly related, let's say you sell a certain supplement line and you have 5 variations of the same supplement. Let's say you sell a like here, a standing desk, right? And you have like 3 different models. So you have products with very similar audiences and you have products with very similar characteristics, then I recommend to structure your asset groups in your PMAX campaigns by audiences, right? So instead of artificially coming up with 5 different asset groups with all kinds of different images for the same or very, very similar products, I usually try with different asset groups first, and I check which of those perform best. With multiple audiences, of course, right? The thing with audiences in PMAX is that Google goes above and beyond these audiences anyway, but you can basically force Google to start with these audiences at least and see where it can take you. So as an example, let's say you go with the standing desk here, right? You can come up with 3 different audiences, let's say, in your campaign, and you can test like business professionals versus work from home people versus, something else, right? And then the advantage here is that you can look at all these 3 seed audiences first, and then you see which one of those performs best initially. And then you can, for example, focus your spend, focus your campaign on that one. I know that there is a lot of ambiguity when you use that approach because, as I said, Google goes beyond these audiences anyway. But I found, and that's just purely from testing, right? Maybe Google has a different stance here. But the thing is, if you do it like that, then you can very quickly tell, okay, that audience isn't working that well, that audience is working better. And that just for us at least works very, very well, including the account that I mentioned here as the example of this video. Now, if you have a store, let's say with 10 categories and a lot of products per category, then a useful way to structure your PMAX campaign is by, of course, having collections, having categories as asset groups, because then you can share the same product images or similar product images. You can share ad copy for that specific category. You can also, of course, set the audience on the asset group level. So if you have multiple categories that are very or pretty unrelated, then of course you want to have different audiences as well. So when you have a bunch of categories, you will have a PMAX structure that uses asset groups for both audiences and individual products and individual assets. But that's the first sort of determining factor for how your PMAX structure should look like. Normally, I start the PMAX campaigns without a target ROAS. It depends. If we have a ton of conversion data, then typically it's easier to start with a target. If you are very tight with your budget, then it can also help to have a target. But if that's not the case, or if you just want to see results very quickly and then you want to check later on what to do with it, I recommend to not use a target and get off the ground quickly. And the moment you are really overspending, the moment you realize, oh, my CPAs are through the roof, or my ROAS is very, very low, then you can come in and have some sort of target that basically limits and restricts Google a little bit. So let's say you start, and with the example of this account from this video here, we look at a ROAS of around 320% all the time, like 300 to 350, which for us is very profitable, right? But we also started with a ROAS that was much lower. And therefore, I added a target into that campaign that we of course changed and modified a million times, but basically we started without a target. We were not that profitable without a target, even though we were spending a lot, and then we were just trying to get that fine line. You probably noticed yourself, PMAX is a lot about this fine line between too much volume but not very profitable, and the other way around, very high ROAS but only focusing on the low-hanging fruits. So you really have to balance this out. And that's one of the many things that you have to do with PMAX along the way. But that's how I recommend you go about it. Go without a target first and see what happens. Then, once you have all these seed audiences, and in the beginning, I recommend to have fairly specific audiences. For example, you can use custom segments that very well describe your product or your category or your store, because those are your lowest hanging fruits. But once you see traction from that, and once you feel like you hit like an invisible ceiling, or once things are a bit slower again, then you can expand your audiences and you can add broader audiences and essentially work your way up. Let's say let's stick with the standing desk example. Let's say you've built a very specific custom segment audience of people searching for standing desks, right? And at some point you cannot really scale anymore. And again, Google goes beyond those audiences anyway, but still I found that when you move up the ladder to like broader, bigger audiences, in-market audiences, maybe even going above that with even broader ones, then you can spend the money a bit better. But I would always start with these very specific ones where you typically get better results. And then once you have quite a bit of data in that PMAX campaign and you want to scale, then you can add those audiences that are a bit broader, a bit bigger, that Google may have tapped into anyway already. But then you make very clear that in the next step, now you want to go with that audience as well. You can edit, and what we usually see then is an actual increase in conversions and value. So that's definitely something that you can try. What you should do along the way is, of course, you should always have an eye on your product performance. So just as with shopping, if you have a PMAX campaign with products, which as an e-commerce brand you probably do, then you should regularly check if there are any highly underperforming products or listing groups that you should get rid of. Because especially with PMAX, it's very easy to not look under the hood too much and just look at the very top level data, maybe the insights, and that's it. Go into your listing groups, check what your products do. Sometimes we literally find products that are wasting hundreds or sometimes even thousands of dollars without having great performance. Of course, it depends on your situation. We have a bunch of clients that do not always care about like maximum ROAS at any given time. But of course, we're not working with like multi-billion-dollar brands that just say, hey, spend the money. All our clients, even the big ones, even the ones making tens of millions of dollars a year, they still want some level of performance all the time. But I'm just saying that if you have a very high budget, sometimes you can say, okay, it's not that critical that we're hitting a 5x ROAS all the time as long as we're scaling, but you should still look at your products, at your listing groups regularly, like at least, very, very least once a week, depending on the account size, etc., if not more. And make sure that especially if your spend is high, that you pause those. Because PMAX, what it does is it spends the budget quite evenly. It tries to spend money on all your asset groups, and then also because of that on many of your products, it's not necessarily cutting off a product very early. So I've seen, especially with people that come to us where I do an audit of their account, I've regularly seen products that were literally spending over $1,000 without a single sale, for example. And that's something that you should be very, very aware of. And then once all of that is established, so once you have your audiences, once you have the products and the PMAX is sort of running quite smoothly, let's say you're spending a few hundred a day profitably, then the shift goes from just experimenting with your audiences all the time to assets. Now, the most important part of a PMAX campaign, of course, are the assets. And that is something that once you have all the other things figured out, because of course you don't have to change your audiences on a weekly basis, especially with very matured PMAX campaigns that basically went into so many other audiences already. Now it's all about regularly testing new assets, maybe also new asset groups, depending on how you have your account set up. But you have to regularly feed it new high quality assets. And that's where we see the biggest spikes in terms of performance, right? So when we have a PMAX campaign that is very mature, spends, I don't know, $1,000 a day or something, or also less, and we put a new set of assets in that we came up with, or that the client provided us with, or that we modified or whatever, that's usually where we can see quite the spikes. Of course, if your PMAX campaign is super focused on shopping, then it doesn't matter too much, right? Because the assets are the assets basically show on the display, discovery, or YouTube network, not on shopping. But if you get some sales from these networks as well, with what many PMAX campaigns do, then you will probably see quite the spike and quite the impact from that. So once you have all these things in place, focus a lot more on the assets than you do on, the micromanagement of audiences and bidding, etc. In general, I can say that there's something like a refresh priority list, right? So the most important thing to refresh on a regular basis once the campaign is established are the assets, and also, the assets, the images, the videos, whatever you're using. Then second, you also have the products. So products are something that you constantly have to keep an eye on, even with a very, very matured campaign. And only number three, you have the audiences. That's different when you just start, because then you want to hit the best audience and you cannot, change your assets on a daily basis initially. But once it's mature, then it sort of shifts asset, product, audience versus audience, product, asset in the beginning, right? Because in the beginning, you just want to find a good audience, decent creatives, get the best creatives in that you have initially, but you shouldn't change your assets on a daily basis in that first 14-day period, for example. There you should just make sure that everything is sort of working all right, and then you can take it from there. Now, there are a few more notes if you want to get the most out of your PMAX campaigns that you should really take into consideration. And the first thing, and I keep saying this, is do not run PMAX campaigns alone. I see a ton of clients, a ton of people that come to us, basically, they have one big fat PMAX campaign, maybe a brand campaign or so, but whenever you can, run search and shopping campaigns alongside it, or discovery, for example. Another example, we have a client selling a consumer product that is, has quite some mass appeal, and we also spend quite a lot on PMAX, but we have a completely separate discovery campaign running alongside it, even though PMAX is technically doing discovery as well. And this discovery just works pretty well. So you shouldn't just rely on PMAX alone just because it does everything, because once you run these other campaign types, these dedicated shopping, dedicated search, dedicated discovery campaigns, typically you can optimize them quite a bit better. PMAX is great if you have limited time, if you have limited resources, if you want to just have something that works okay and can be scaled. But if you want to go the extra mile, if you have a very high budget and you want to get the absolute max out of it, then you should run all the campaign types that are available. Of course, minus the ones that don't really apply to you, or if you don't have any video assets, you can leave YouTube out, obviously. But if you have the time, or if you have the resources, or if you have a consultant, or if you have someone like us working with you, then you should really have all these other campaign types as well, because that's really where you can get the most sort of consistency and also the best performance. Second, as I said, don't bother running PMAX campaigns with very low budgets, because that will just take forever to optimize. They will never be better than other campaigns, at least if you subtract the brand sales, because of course PMAX creates a lot of brand sales as well. And some people run very cheap PMAX campaigns and say, oh, they are working, but then it's all brand because they're on a low budget and the budget goes directly to brand. So just avoid that. Then three, what is also very important is that you don't run PMAX campaigns for regardless of what you sell. I've seen people having very specific B2B products, very complex machinery, and PMAX isn't perfect for that, right? PMAX is great for mass appeal, it's great for scaling, it's great for having a bunch of great assets, but if it gets very technical, very expensive, very unique, very specific, then you're typically better off with search and shopping with a ton of negative keywords, right? So don't have or don't see PMAX as this sort of one-size-fits-all kind of thing that just applies to everything and that you can scale to the moon no matter what. Look at your store, ask yourself, is PMAX a good idea? With most of our clients, most of them, B2C, direct-to-consumer e-commerce brands, that's the case. But we also certainly have a handful where this makes very, very little sense. And the moment that we replaced their original PMAX campaigns with our setup, it worked a lot better. So that's really something that you should look at and make sure that you do the right thing. And number 4 is, if you have like a very small budget, or if you don't have the time, as I said, having like a little PMAX campaign going there with the minimum budget, like $50 to $100, it can be your solution if you don't want to bother about Google Ads too much. As I said, you will never get the most out of it, but you will probably get a decent return if your store is optimized, if you have good assets and everything. You will probably just get some money from it. And that's really a very helpful campaign type if you want to do it like that. But as I said, the moment you want to go the extra mile, scale more, squeeze out another 20, 30, 50% of ROAS, etc., then it's where you have to do these other things as well. But in that sense, PMAX is quite beginner friendly if you don't have the time and don't have the money, etc. So you might want to try that out. These were my points about scaling PMAX campaigns and the steps to get there based on an actual real-life example. If you want to learn more, then of course subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment basically saying what you have done with PMAX so far. What are your challenges with PMAX? Is there something that I should talk about with PMAX specifically, or other Google Ads topics to help you out? And of course, if you want us to help you with your Google Ads account with PMAX, but also shopping, search, etc. for your e-commerce business, make sure to check the link in the description, cartlift.co. Or if you want to learn it yourself, visit the ecomppcacademy.com, where I show how to scale your e-commerce brand using shopping, search, PMAX, YouTube, you name it. If you want to study it yourself, then that's your place to go. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, as I said, please leave a like and please subscribe, and I look forward to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.